Many of you probably remember, at the end of the millennium, if you can remember back that far, the architectural avant-garde was really steeped and wrapped up in a kind of practice of theory and writing. And the work that was coming out of architecture at that time was often painfully esoteric and wrapped in kind of difficult ideas. And at that time, architecture had been getting further and further away from a commitment to building as a practice. And increasingly had become dependent on external sources like philosophy and science to legitimize the work that architects were producing. And this practice really exhausted itself when the influential journal Assemblage imploded. And this journal Assemblage, as you probably remember, was a clearinghouse for architecture understood to be a kind of philosophy. So in 1999, Assemblage, this journal collapsed. It imploded, it deconstructed. And at that moment, it created a kind of existential void within the discipline. Architects didn't really know how to move forward from that moment. And so young practitioners had an entirely new opportunity to reconceive of what an architectural practice might be. And it's at that same year, in 1999, that Mimi Hoang and her partner Eric Bungay created their practice nARCHITECTS. So like other emerging practices at that moment, nARCHITECTS turned their practice and their attention towards an earnest consideration of building as practice, of construction technology, and of craft. And in this sense, nARCHITECTS could show that there was no ideas but in things, and the hard-boiled reality of making buildings, which really had been neglected, we'll say, within architecture for quite a long time. But as a recently published monograph entitled Buildings and Almost Buildings suggests, I think there's a catch. The word almost suggests uncertainty and irresolution, and kind of ethos that's foreign to our profession. As many of you, probably all practicing architects, will know, architecture is meant to be a kind of quantifiable product that's driven by evidence-based design, measurable performance, KPIs, etc. And in this context, nARCHITECTS works suggest a totally divergent project, that the word almost, the ethos of almost, could actually be a project of incompletion, a project of openness, and one that refuses to deliver prescriptive outcomes, one that serves as a platform for the unexpected. And this is what I find so compelling about the work that we're going to see tonight. In a kind of counterintuitive way, it leverages a sincere knowledge of buildings as an ambition to undo buildings. So Mimi Hoang is a co-founder of nARCHITECTS, and she's also an assistant professor of Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Preservation, and Planning, where she has taught for nearly a decade. nARCHITECTS has won numerous awards and grants, more than it's worth repeating, and for many years has been named as a leading practice in the United States. nARCHITECTS has also, interestingly, been referred to as an emerging practice, even though their practice really emerged over 20 years ago. So here's to hoping that they continue to emerge over the next 20 years. Please welcome Mimi Hoang.
Hello. Thank you so much for that beautiful intro. Thank you, Mark, for the invitation, and CCA for hosting. I'm very happy to be with you. I feel very attached to the CCA. My mother went to the CCA back when there was a C at the end of it. She was here in the States on scholarship, part of a federal scholarship program that the US was giving to select Vietnamese students, which is a very long time ago. That part of her history I knew. What I didn't know, which she only revealed to me much later in life, was that after having tried to dissuade me from becoming an architect, studying architecture, she informed me in my mid-30s that she had been the only draftswoman in an architecture firm in Saigon, 1967 to 1969. And she had hid it from me because she really didn't want me to be an architect, because she understood how difficult it was. I thought that she was just being the usual pain in my side. But it just goes to show you that children never do what their parents tell them to, and that mothers are always right. It is really hard. Nevertheless, Buildings and Almost Buildings is about questions that we've been asking about architecture for a long time, about the physical limits, the objective aspects of our built environment, and its subjective experience. So after we finished Canopy at MoMA PS1 in 2004, we would go and hang out like flies on the wall, anonymous spectators to the activities around us. We had conceived Canopy as a framework for microclimates and social exchanges, but without hard boundaries or overt functions. We thought of it as an almost building. An almost building that invited transformation and interpretation by others, by the users and what we started to call the misusers, these people who decided to TP our canopy, and this guy who sent us this unsolicited installation, the users and misusers who had appropriated our installation as their own. At the end of the summer, we sold the bamboo to the artist Matthew Barney, who used it as scaffolding in his upcoming movie with Björk. At the time, we were just trying to recoup our debt from building Canopy, but in hindsight, we love the fact that it went from one kind of armature to another. So is architecture necessarily complete ever? Or is it a state of indeterminacy that incites us to engage with it? Whereas earlier in our career, we were trying to make our early installations as building-like as possible, we now find ourselves trying to embody the attributes of the almost building in our more permanent work, and asking the question, can they remain incomplete and embrace ambiguity in positive ways? At what point is architecture complete? This is a question that we recognize as part of the current zeitgeist in considering the open-endedness in architecture. We are asking this question through 3 different frameworks: incomplete armatures, boundaries, and zones. So at its most reduced, architecture is often represented as an armature. Logier's 18th century depiction of the primitive hut and Le Corbusier's domino house, almost like an X-ray of the constructive potential of architecture, we see both of these as almost buildings, imagining them as a midway point between something else and a building. But they're incomplete, they're missing something. They are armatures capable of endless reconfiguration, awaiting the enactment of their potential. And for us, what is most exciting is that in its social and formal aspects, they remain uncertain and informal. This is the largest armature that we've proposed. In the 60s, the idea of the armature was elevated to megastructure, operating at the scale of the city. We're very interested in that, but we are also interested in the more finite scale of the building. So for this competition on the Detroit waterfront, we're operating at the building scale and at the scale of infrastructure. Like many American cities, Detroit is reclaiming its post-industrial landscape, and so this competition was to turn this formerly industrial landscape into a public park all along the river. The challenge of the project was not only to, I'm trying to find a laser. The challenge of the project was not only to build this park and to invite people to the water's edge where they previously never went, but also to negotiate this kind of transition between city activity and waterfront activity. And so we proposed this open porch, a very, very long armature, 2,100-foot long armature, that was meant to be built in stages that would support all the park activity. We spent a while searching for the form, for the variation in form, and settled on a very simple trellis-like open structure underneath which were all the programs. And we thought that the porch would literally support the different amenities, the shade trellis, the rain cover, the vertical gardens, the play equipment, and the utilities for the park, the Wi-Fi, the mists, etc. It's made out of glulam timber construction and steel, and is meant to appear intimate in some places, endless in others, a work in progress where you don't build it all at the same time, but you start to slowly accrete amenities and function as the city gets used to it. It's open to appropriation by people and plants. But perhaps it was too big because we didn't win. But here's another idea of an incomplete armature. This is under construction. This is our project for a park pavilion in Hoboken. Hoboken is very close to the sea level. If it rains 1 inch in Hoboken, there's outfall, which means that the rainwater combines with the sewage. And so this park is going to be the largest community park in Hoboken and is designed to contain 1 million gallons of rainwater underneath the park. We think that we should be considering environmental resiliency along with social resiliency, and so the park pavilion supports all the kind of public programming and amenities of the park. From this side of the pavilion, or from the canopy, we'll hang the movie screen for movie night for people gathering in that lawn. It is the only structure in the park. The canopy itself is much larger in footprint than the actual interior space, which is something that we do quite a bit in order to bring outdoor and landscape realm and thinking into architecture and vice versa. And so this is the space that you get in between the two volumes. One is a community room and the other is the annex to the Hoboken Library. And this kind of shows you this kind of layering that we're after, from inside to outside, back inside to outside again, kind of making very ambiguous where the building starts and ends. This is a worm's eye axonometric of the project, which shows you what else that canopy supports, namely the public amenities, the swings, the water features, and what we call the Dr. Seuss trees, which are climbing plants that mask the columns and allow the kind of language of trees and the screening effect of landscape to camouflage the structure of the building. The third armature is a real commission that we received after losing Detroit. This one is also under construction. This is the Jones Beach Energy and Nature Center. It is on a barrier island. It's almost completely artificial. It is the first line of defense. It's a very vulnerable spot in Long Island Sound. It's also extremely beautiful. This is where there's a lot of natural wild habitat. It also has the dubious claim of being one of the nation's largest parking lots, which we are chopping out. But this is one of Robert Moses' more positive legacies, the building of these kinds of public spaces and beach, public spaces and amenities for all. This is the east end of the beach, the more popular, active end. We are on the west end, which is much more isolated, again, home to plovers and terrapin turtles and other wildlife. We are, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a low-slung 1960s building in the horizon. We are removing that building and reusing the piles and foundation, building up from that. And so you can understand this project as just negotiating all those constraints. We are right at the flood line. We could not encroach further to the water, and so we elongated the existing footprint even longer, reused the piles, chopped out 2/3 of the concrete parking structure, and used that as the rubble to lift the building up above the flood line. So it's very much an education-focused building for school children mainly, to learn about the correlation between nature and energy. There's two funding sources, New York State Parks and the local power authority. At one point, they really had their own fiefdoms and they refused to share anything, but we had to make it one project, and so ultimately we convinced everybody to share the exhibition space. So the specific program is in the volumes. The exhibition space kind of meanders in between the volumes, and it's about the correlation between nature and energy. The sawtooth roof basically allows north light into that exhibition space, and it kind of gives this cadence to the building: dark, light, low, high, as you go from exhibition into classrooms or multifunction spaces, back out into the exhibition. And so the cross-section shows you this kind of continuous long gallery that links all of the exhibition space. And it is also showing you that we really thought of the building as in between the indoor and the outdoor. The outdoor educational opportunities being viewing the habitat, the whole skeleton of a whale that is out there, too big to fit in the building. And so the teaching is happening in between the inside and the outside. This is the view from the water's side, facing Long Island Sound, no, facing the Atlantic. We worked a bit on the identity of the building. We tried to do something with these pitched roofs. We thought, it's great, it looks like waves, you know, there's waves in nature, waves in energy. The client thought it looked like sharks, and so that was off the table. But this is showing you this kind of rhythm of these open exhibition spaces and then the more closed spaces, and how we really hope that the building will be animated by the indoor-outdoor classroom function, but also the play of light animating against the cladding. And so this is a view out to that outdoor classroom and a view down the continuous gallery. We are very excited that the governor, our governor, was very excited about the project, and he has turned it into the poster child for New York State's commitment to the Green New Deal. And so it is net zero. It will produce as much energy as it consumes, with the help of 300 solar panels on the roof. And this picture is from 2 weeks ago. So come to New York in the fall, hopefully it'll be ready. So as we've been exploring the range of possibilities for the armature, which oscillates between appearing and disappearing in its expression, we're asking similar questions at the boundaries of our work. Can the boundary be complete and incomplete in different places, or at different times and in different ways? Full confession, we are obsessed with making holes. We like cutting into building, creating erasures from the shallow to the deep, which is a way in which we are trying to confound the limits between buildings and their contexts. It's also an act of sneakily transferring public domain into the private. And so for us, and also extending the public's, or the macro scale of the city into our work. And so for us, the Almost building is variably connected to the environment. And we see these limits not as a single thickness, but as multiple layers and depths, which brings into question, where does a building begin or end? This is our project for ADO, which is for Cooper, the car company, which is owned by BMW. This is, for them, a design center, a design platform, a place for tinkerers, innovators, entrepreneurs working on issues of livability in cities and issues of mobility. And so there are a lot of different actors in this project. It is a renovation of a former factory, a former bra factory. Has nothing to do with the project, but anyway, that's the history. It's in a very industrial site in Brooklyn that is fast gentrifying. So around all of this are all these condos and hotels that are popping up. But there is still a manufacturing base in this area of town. Stone workers, metal workers, etc. This is the existing building. We love working with ugly buildings. Nobody cares about them. We can do whatever we want. It's very liberating. And so we cut into it This is on axis with the street that ends, and so we cut into it, creating this little pocket park, and we made all sorts of cuts. All the windows that you see are actually enlargements of the existing, much smaller windows. And so we had a lot of this brick lying around that was covered in graffiti. We asked the contractors to reframe all the windows with that graffiti brick, and we called it remixed graffiti or reconstituted graffiti. We thought it was brilliant, but the graffiti artist came back and re-tagged everything, having not appreciated the subtlety. But that's okay. We invite misappropriation of our work. But so in that way, we are asking the question of how do we bring the new into the old? How do we do it in a not binary, obvious way? How do we layer the new into the old in more interesting ways? And how do we kind of remix the contemporary history with the old history? So this is a project. It's about 23,000 square feet. In the middle is the free space. We call it the free space. To our knowledge, it's the only free co-working space in the city. Around it, to the left is the restaurant, business accelerator space, workshop in the right corner, a retail, some classrooms, and then another courtyard in the back. The synergy between all these spaces is super interesting. And so we had designed a bunch of custom furniture. We love coming back to ADO because it is always different. They host about 200 events a year. They partnered with a lot of cultural institutions in the city and design schools. And so they're constantly hosting different formats for engagement. And it always looks different when we go back. This is a view from the restaurant looking into that free space, and then a view from that free space looking back. There's a lot of different kinds of programs. The client said, no walls, we don't like walls. But, you need some walls. So we put a quadruple layer of acoustic curtain, which you see in order to handle the acoustic separation without overt, hard boundaries between all the functions. So in that free space, they host installations, exhibitions, events, some not so good art, some better art. Well, it depends on your opinion. And above that is what we call the periscope, which is a very large skylight. And we love the fact that as the content below is changing, the light and the reflections that are coming from the periscope is also changing. The story of the periscope is that the client, Mini, is from Munich, and when they approached us for the project, they were not sure where in New York they should be, launching this space. Should we be in Manhattan? Should we be in Brooklyn? They weren't sure. They really wanted this view of Manhattan. We couldn't give it to them because of the zoning in this industrial neighborhood. You can't have an occupiable roof. But we said, don't worry, we will bring Manhattan to you. And so this periscope is at an angle, and it's mirrored. It's actually polished stainless steel. It acts like a mirror. One side reflects this very rapidly gentrifying avenue down Brooklyn, in Brooklyn, with the skyscrapers. And then to the right facet, you see the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building if you stand in a certain way. So it's this kind of surreal new context that we are trying to create, and also is a way for us to ground our work in the local context, but also to speak to the broader context and scale of Manhattan. We didn't design it as an Instagrammable moment, but it is an Instagrammable moment. Our client obsessively posts, every change of light, every sunset, every flicker of a new reflection, which makes us happy. The last space is this courtyard, which was an interior space, but we looked at their program and said, you don't need this, more space. You don't need it. Let's just rip the roof off and see what happens. Let's invite artists to come and intervene and do, make installations. And so this was the first one by Assemble Collective, the group from London. This was their installation called The Factory. This was another one by United Visual Artists, which we loved because this is exactly what we wanted, for some other designers and artists to come in and reinterpret the building, reappropriate it to be their own. And it's also interesting for us because we are working on several manufacturing buildings, renovating them in these post-industrial sites. And we think about how, the historic zoning of cities tended to produce silos of use, silos of industrial use separate from the rest of the city for environmental reasons. And now, as we are making those waterfronts more public, this is a chance to make work and different kinds of work processes visible and participatory. So at one point, this boundary becomes really thick and it becomes a zone, but it's the same questions of, can we play with this kind of, in-between zone between indoor and outdoor, between building scale and city scale, that we really like to dwell on. And so the clearest example of that is the New York State Equal Rights Center that we completed 2 years ago. It's in upstate New York. It's in a very beautiful area. It's a very historic town. This is the town where Harriet Tubman lived the latter part of her life. This is where she was buried. It's a very rich history in the Finger Lakes region, literally, because there are these long Finger Lakes. A very, very sensitive and political site. All around us are the town's most important buildings. City Hall, I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out how to clip this thing. It's very distracting. But City Hall, historic church, the historic YMCA, also to the right of the site. The site is a public surface parking lot, but to the right of the site is William Seward's house. William Seward was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. That's the house right there, the historic Westminster Church. And so that is a very difficult physical context that we were working with. The other context is the historic social one. This is the region where it was this is next to Seneca Falls, and so this region of New York was very important during the civil rights movement, the suffragette movement, the LGBTQ rights, but it is also the largest prison system in the state, and so it is a very fraught history. So we are trying to connect and mediate between the physical and the social context. This is our landscape of inefficiency, trying to find the right expression of something that is institutional, but it sits on a street with all these neoclassical federal and Georgian houses. And so we analyzed those houses and understood that they're never really one volume. They're always a kind of accretion of volumes. And so our project is the one all the way to the right, which is conceived as 3.5 volumes, kind of pivoting and cranking, opening itself to the site and framing important views around the site. And so all the building function, the specific functions are in those cores, and the exhibition is this meandering loop around the perimeter, which allows you to look at the exhibition with the context of the site beyond the building. So this is one of those hinge moments with a view of William Seward's house and how it turned out. It was a very fast project, 6 months to design, 3 months for bid, 9 months for construction. And so we decided early on that the architecture had to be very primitive, as minimal as possible, as minimum layers as possible. And so the structural walls, the concrete structural walls, are the finished surface on the inside. The roof is glulam timber. The roof deck is also glulam timber deck. And so the structure is the finish, and that's what you get, which is what you see in this wall section. And we are after this kind of primitive expression of architecture, raw and unpolished. And the brick detailing draws a lot from the historic brick that is all around, even though the form of the building is contemporary. And so this is a diagram of the exhibition, which is organized by medium, not so much by theme, because the themes really overlap. So upon entry, you see this map, because the building is really a portal, a physical portal to the other sites, historic sites in the town. And you, upon arrival, you can go left or you can go right. We're going to go left around. This is one of our furniture pieces. It's called the Lake Lounger, the Finger Lake Lounger. It's the actual bathymetry of one of the lakes. I forget which one. So we are trying to bring the kind of regional context and the physical attributes of the site into the building. This is Speech Island. You can sit here and listen to historic speeches. Some of them are original. Many of them are re-recorded by members of the community. And so this is a way in which the institution is a connection between the kind of past history and the contemporary community. Sorry, that was the social justice table. And the view of it from the outside. Another one of these hinge moments from the outside. But you can see, like, it's this moment where you can see right through the building, inside and out again to the Seward House, and then that same view from above. This is opening day. It's probably the most rewarding project opening of ours that we've been to, because this is the first municipal building that they build in the town in 40 years. The last one they built was that hideous parking lot. So everybody turned out. It really felt like the entire town was there. And the great-great-grandniece of Harriet Tubman was there to cut the ribbon. And we asked her, "What do you think?" And she said, "It's better than I thought." Which I thought was really great. The next two projects are playing with this idea of the incomplete zone in plan and section for a very different climate and culture. This was an invitation, 100 architects that Ai Weiwei invited to design a 10,000 square foot villa in the middle of the desert in Inner Mongolia, with no specific client, which was very strange to us. We were told, build it and they will come. Two gut reactions shaped our project. One, the weather. It is extremely cold and inhospitable in the winter. And in the summer, it's extremely hot and inhospitable. So there's no lounging around outside. And secondly, coming from New York, why do you need 10,000 square feet? So we thought of designing an inner house that was wrapped by an outer house. The inner house is what you need, and the outer house is what you desire in more temperate climate. But it is a thermal logic. It is about reducing the amount of energy that one consumes, and so the inner house is actually properly heated and cooled and fully insulated, and it has more polished materials. The outer house is not heated nor cooled, and is only really viable in temperate climate. So in temperate seasons. And so we worked with Arup on the thermal modeling. This is a 1 to 10 scale model of that thermal model, which shows you the extreme cold with the blue dots. The green is somewhere in between. The red is the inner house. That's the warm environment. And each of the floors stacks on each other, seemingly irreverently. Very, very different experiences on each floor. But you can see the inner house in the paler color, and the outer house is the kind of interstitial space on the outside. And it's an idea that living as a notion expands and contracts with the seasons, that you retreat like a bear in the winter into your inner house, and you expand to the outer house in the warmer seasons. It was never built, which explains the aesthetic of these renderings, these kind of half-abandoned construction site. It was never, the project didn't, they never came. The project didn't go forward because the client fell out of favor with the government and exiled himself to London. But we still kept thinking about this idea of an inner building wrapped around an outer building with this fantastic interstitial space in between. And so we tried it again, this time for a 1 million square foot library in Shanghai. So it is sited next to their Central Park, basically, which explains our siting of the building to kind of maximize that park coming into the building, to protect that view corridor to the park, and to make the building as compact as possible on the site. We drew a lot of inspiration from the world's oldest library, called Tianyuge. And it's a palace library, it's an imperial library, it's still there. The reading floor is on the ground level, contiguous with the garden and the water feature. The books were above, protected from the insects and the mildew. And so that is basically the DNA of our project. We took the compact floor and the open floor. Let's call it an open face sandwich. The compact floor is for book storage, and the open floors are all the kind of reading spaces, the publicly accessed study areas, the more expansive. And we stacked very differently configured floor plates on top of each other to create this ambiguous space in between. And so this is, you can kind of see it in the plans. What connects each open floor are this long route, these kind of curved stairs that take you from open floor to open floor along the perimeter, which is a double glazed facade that captures the greenery. And so you would see this kind of captured landscape, and beyond that, their Century Park from the library. And so it starts with very informal kind of library floors, and slowly you arrive at the top, which is the more formal study. So as paper was invented in China, they also invented the printing block, and the first printing block was out of terracotta, which explains this screen lattice for the facade. The unglazed terracotta faces inside, and the iridescent glazed terracotta faces the outside. So we apparently won, but later we were informed that they had run this parallel competition for the more experienced architects. We were the young architects, not even emerging. So in fact, we didn't win anything at all. So we built this model, which is what we do when we lose competitions. We build these models, and they hang around in their office, reminding us to try it again next time. The last example of incomplete zones is this project in Calgary that we just finished, on the boardwalk of the Bow River. This is another post-industrial site, formerly a very derelict neighborhood, now emerging as a very well-loved public space in Calgary, this river walk. It's interesting building in Calgary. There's no zoning envelope to work with. What we had to work with, which you can kind of tell because all the buildings are stepped, what we had to work with, and it's a funny trapezoidal site that nobody wanted to develop because they thought it was too weird. What we had to work with was, you see that line? You cannot cast a shadow beyond 1.8 meters on September 21st at 4 p.m. That's it. There's no zoning envelope. So the form of the building, this zigzag, is us negotiating the developer's desire to maximize the building footprint with, not casting that shadow. But it is also an idea to take the public activity of that promenade and zipper it up the building. So this is a rendering, and these are snapshots that we took, not professional photos yet, of the opening from last month. And you can see this is the side that faces the boardwalk, that zigzaggy terrace. It's a building with it's a building with no back face, because one side faces the river, this side, which is where the egress stair and the freight elevators are, this is the street side, and the short ends are the portals and entryways into the promenade. So that was quite challenging. But those triangular windows, that's the egress stair. So if the questions about the incomplete are about the physical limits of architecture, for us, we are exploring notions of ambiguity to explore the subjective limits and the perception of architecture. This is a piece at the Storm King Art Center in New York, just outside the city. If you've been there, you may have seen this piece by Alison Schatz called Mirror Fence. But maybe you missed it altogether because it tends to disappear into a landscape of light and weather and seasons. We are obsessed with similar things in our work. How can we register the impermanent context of our project? And how can we fold the perception of our buildings into its surroundings, collapsing far with near or object with field? We are, of course, drawing from a long discourse about ambiguity, from Empson to Venturi to Rowe. Our focus is partly on conveying the material and temporal ambiguity, remixing contexts and trying to destabilize the perception of buildings. And so the clearest example of that is a project that we finished in Chicago, the Chicago Navy Pier. If you've been to Chicago, you may have come to Navy Pier. If you are Chicagoan, you definitely never go because it was a tourist trap. Before the Millennium Park and before the Bean, this was the most visited site, tourist destination in the state of Illinois. This is actually one of Burnham's 5 piers, but only one was ever built. It's been everything from a arms manufacturing site during the war to a university to the People's Pier, which is the existing condition that we inherited. It was so crammed full of vendors and commerce that you couldn't actually see the lake or the city. And so much of our work on the pier was just to erase the clutter and to re-engage and turn the pier back to the city and the lake. And so all the structures, the big and the small ones, are trying to re-engage, reframe, reflect the city in some way. Starting with a series of lake pavilions, which started with, can we just take a slice of the lake and float it above the pier? Because in the summer, the lake is this Caribbean blue, but it freezes completely in the winter. And so of course the weather is different, but the color of the lake is dramatically different. And we wanted to register that in the lake pavilions. And so they are these framing devices, framing the view of the lake, framing the view of the promenade, and they always look different. And so because of the ripple, one side is rippling, reflecting the pedestrian activity of the promenade, and the other side is reflecting the water, collapsing it into one plane. And so every time you go, it looks a little bit different. It feels a little bit different, sounds different. And it's a moment, several moments of respite along a very busy 1 kilometer long pier, a little moment for pause. At the beginning of the pier, to mark the head of the pier, they used to have this kind of red lattice arch frame, which did everything to announce that this is the other space. This is not part of the city. This is a kind of marginalized, carnivalesque periphery of the city. And so we tore that down and built this info tower, which if you stand in a certain spot, it is a mini-me of the Chicago skyline, but it's actually only 45 feet tall. And this is another way in which we are trying to borrow the view of the skyscrapers that are several blocks away and divided by an elevated highway. We're borrowing that view into the context of our project and trying to play with that scale in a light way. So it's clad in this glass that has a chrome frit. And there's more and more of that chrome frit, the taller it rises, and so it picks up on the gray Chicago sky in the winter, it picks up on the surrounding buildings depending on your own vantage point. It's about movement, moving your body in order to register these changes. And the light program is evoking a much further context. It's the moon. So in a new moon, this light is very warm and amber in color. And with a full moon, it's much, much brighter. Another way in which we're trying to respond to the environmental conditions of our projects. So, is the Ponte Vecchio a fragment of a street or a continuous building? It started as a bridge for the Medicis to cross. And then I think they built that apartment on top so that they could cross unseen. And then slowly these shops appeared as an economic revenue generator. It is both and, typologically ambiguous, hybrid, both street and building. We love to think about this condition. For us, architecture is a series of positions between building and not building. It's close to something, but it's almost something else. And somewhere in between is the idea of the almost building and where we have the most fun. And what fascinates us about this kind of indeterminacy is the variety of interpretations and therefore experiences that could emerge. So a simple example of that is the Forest Pavilion that we built in Taiwan, on the eastern side of Taiwan, which is a very beautiful ecological site. We were invited to do an art installation. We're not artists, and so we looked into the area, the inhabitants of the area, and realized that the Aboriginal tribes who live there were the ones who would be using it. And storytelling and dance is very important to them. And so we wanted to create a polycentric pavilion for their storytelling and dance and music. And what is very interesting, it's obviously playing with stage, proscenium, but not just one stage and not one proscenium. 11 vaulted, curved vaults wrapping around the deck. Is the middle of the stage, is the proscenium, the space underneath the stage. It changes depending on the user. This really came out of our understanding of who the Amis, the Aboriginal tribe, were. When they gather, their storytelling and singing is very reflexive. It's not formal at all. And so I could be up there singing and you could be heckling at me and somebody else might join. And it's a very kind of reflexive thing. It's very participatory. It goes around and around in circles. And this is what we were after, that this kind of space of the spectator versus the performer is never stable. It's always changing depending on its users, and it's always dynamic, and the roles and the spaces themselves can reverse themselves. Back on the pier, another example of typological ambiguity is the biggest structure that we built called the wave wall. It was to answer a simple aspect of the brief, which was to connect the lower promenade with the upper promenade. We argued that you need social gathering space. It was a long fight with the client. They wanted just 500 linear feet of storefront for the food and beverage that was underneath this, and we argued that social gathering space is good for business. People need to sit, and so it's very inspired by the Spanish Steps. But this is a moment where the wall starts as a wall, cants out to create this kind of shading, louvered area and overlook, and then cants back in to create this 120-foot wide stair. It's a singular gesture, but it was built in a modular fashion with these cassettes of steel louvers. And so the louvers actually slowly start separating and becomes the stair. The contractor grumpily called it the Swiss watch of stairs, which we took as a compliment. And so you can see these kind of overlooks that get you a little bit closer to the lake, and then the undulation back to create this gathering space, reframing the city or the fireworks. It's operating for us in this in-between. It's a stair, it's landscape, it's a building, it's building scale, it's landscape scale, all of the above. The last project that I want to show you is Carmel Place, which was a winning proposal for a competition that was launched by our former mayor to address the housing crisis in New York. And it was also responding to research that shows how the demographics of our cities have radically changed and how the housing stock and the regulations of building have not kept up with who we are. So this is Manhattan in a, where is this? Mid-Manhattan, East Side. It sits in this bowl, actually, with market rate and public housing all around. So we have 1.8 million small households in New York. It's technically 1 to 2 people per household, but only 1 million apartments, suitable apartments, which means that there are a lot of us who are cramming ourselves into illegal sublets. But the story really starts with Jacob Riis, who was the Danish immigrant photojournalist who turned his cameras on the plight of the immigrant working class at the turn of the century. And at that time, it was nearly half of the city's population, revealing their living conditions without proper ventilation, lack of sewage, lack of water. And so all of our housing regulations is born out of this moment in history. And so you can understand that, you know, all of our regulations for standard window or minimum window sizes, minimum apartment sizes, came out of this work. But the paradox is that the American home has been ballooning, almost doubling since the 50s, but we have been shrinking in terms of what we call a family unit. And this is not specific to New York, but the nuclear family is definitely not the majority anymore. We are studying more, women are studying more, marrying later, divorcing more. I mean, the women and the men are divorcing more. And we are living more healthily, more green, we're living longer. There are more and more of us who are living alone. And so the competition, and it's not just national, but also international, and obviously culturally related. But so the competition was launched to ask, should we shrink the minimum size of apartment in New York, which was before the competition 400 square feet, and 8-foot tall ceilings? Should we shrink that? Is that still humane? Can we make it a viable option in order to increase density? And so these were test fits that the City Planning Commission did, this is not our project, in launching this competition. We proposed a modular construction project, which definitely was which definitely helped. That was the rendering. This is the final building. But for us, it wasn't only about how do you make small spaces feel more humane, but can we rethink living in apartment buildings? Should we think about the idea of the dispersed home, where you should find all the amenities that you might find in a bigger home, but just not within the four walls of your apartment, but dispersed throughout your apartment building? And so we worked to situate all the amenity spaces where there would be the most amount of social interaction, and to make those amenity spaces really feel like part of the street life or part of the shared corridor. And this is our site. We are the David amongst the Goliaths, surrounded by all these brick buildings. We had two construction sites to visit, the actual site and the modular factory, because it was all the units were built with modular construction, which allowed us to make a lot less noise on site, which really helped in terms of the neighbors, the public housing neighbors, and all the hospitals around. But it also helped because we were working within a 1/8 inch construction tolerance, because the site was so small, and because we lost a lot of room, because when you stack modular units together, you get double walls and double floors and ceilings. 1/8 inch tolerance is not possible in traditional construction. That's the factory. It's like a Ford, Model T Ford. There's the chassis, the structure goes on top, and it goes out the door that way as it gets more and more completed. And so when it leaves the factory, almost everything is in. All the finishes, the lights, the plumbing fixtures, the windows, everything except for the appliances, which roll around, and the brick cladding on the outside, which was done in site. And so they literally stack like Legos because the units are self-supporting. So inside that wall assembly are 4x4 steel posts that basically are welded, are tabbed and welded to each other. This is the setting process. It took 3.5 weeks to set all of the modules. The elevator core and stair core was another module. This video makes it look easy, but it wasn't. So this is the typical floor plate plan of all those units. And so you can see that each unit is the apartment and a little bit of the corridor. And so they leave the gyprock on the corridor side open so that they can do all of the connections in between the floors on site. So it's interesting to kind of think about, what aspect is modular and what aspects still need to be connected, like your plumbing line. Inside, so we shrank the average size of the floor plate by 25%, 400 to 300, but we actually only shrank the volume by 10% because the ceiling height is very generous. It's 9'8". We felt that we should really give a very generous ceiling height. All the windows are 8 foot tall and they all go down to the ground. And with the help of reconfigurable furniture, they're all studio apartments, and so living, sleeping is occurring in the same space. And the windows are, we like to say that the apartments shrank, but everything else was supersized. The windows, the module of the brick, the windows all go down to the ground to really help you feel very connected to the street, even though the apartment is quite small. And so you can see on this plan that, we shrank the living space of the unit, but nothing else. So it kind of looks like a plan of kitchens and bathrooms because those are all still handicap accessible. But we imagined that, even though you want to live by yourself, it doesn't mean that people want to be alone. So what we are after is trying to orchestrate this kind of social community within the building. So the building sits in between a light-clad brick and a dark-clad brick. building on the other side. So we really thought of it as kind of stitching these two buildings together. And so the massing is like a microcosm of the city, 4 mini towers going from white to dark gray. Oops. So the epilogue to this is that the City Planning Commission is allowing micro units, not as of right, but on a case-by-case basis. But there's been increased interest in building assisted living facilities using micro units, which is another demographic that would really benefit from these kind of intense community-oriented buildings. And lastly, this is related on the boards. We signed an NDA, so I shouldn't be showing this, but this is a much larger project, 300,000 square feet, 680 beds in Miami, and really just trying to continue to work on this idea of single living in terms of the unit, but extremely engaged and integrated social spaces. And so it's a it's a double loaded corridor on one end, a single loaded corridor around this courtyard, which has all the shared amenities spaces. So this is open to the public as well as to the tenants. And so, you really would rub up against all of these spaces as you walk around the corridor. And it produces this kind of very, kind of like condensed social space in the heart of the building. So to close, this is a photo, an art piece from our dear friend, artist Nina Katchadorian, where 7 peas have appeared to invade an Italianate garden. This is part of her a series called Seat Assignments, photographs that she produces only when she flies and in an airplane cabin and only with the things that are at hand. So this is part of her dinner and a photo from an in-flight magazine. And it's our daily inspiration it's our daily inspiration for our work because I think it perfectly captures what we are trying to do to produce an architecture that simultaneously occupies different realms. On the one hand, irreverently, and on the other hand, super engaged with its context. And it's very much a metaphor for our practice. And so that is what we've tried to capture in this book. The temporal aspects of architecture as well as the physical aspects as we put forward an idea of an architecture that engages a world in flux, very much in flux, whether we are dealing with climate change or rising sea levels or the change in how we work, how we engage with each other in public space, or changing demographics. We are interested in putting forward an architecture that embraces the impermanence of things and their perception. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. I'm sorry if that was overly academic, but we all have our contexts. I'm happy to take questions, anything.
Hold on, sorry. I'll bring the microphone to you. I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions.
Building the Mini Cooper building in Brooklyn with the graffiti on it, I thought that was a brilliant way of inviting the community to become part of the design. Do you do more of, or is that part of the things that you look at?
Yes, it's part of what we mean by an architecture that invites appropriation. So we're trying to do it in formal ways and informal ways. There are other aspects of that project, other furniture pieces that were commissioned by other designers. Definitely the graffiti was the more informal one, and we didn't always like what happened to it after, but we, at the end of the day, love that it provokes an engagement, right? An opinion is better than no opinion, and even if they retag over it, or the client, has now completely changed it, but that is also really exciting to us, that it's a constant work in progress. And so, if we can get people to care about architecture, it's better than being ignored, even if they're retagging it over what we designed.
I'm curious between the kind of heartbreaking nature of competitions, but also the desire to create the model to kind of commemorate or maybe continue to work through that.
Yeah, it's a memorial.
Especially thinking about kind of your interest in impermanence and thinking about architectural objects as maybe not being so permanent. If you could speak to kind of that, I don't know, maybe that tension.
Can you keep talking? What do you mean by art? So you're saying architectural objects are not permanent?
Well, from kind of your ending statement about kind of an interest in the impermanence of objects, but yet the kind of need or the desire to create the model as a kind of as an end piece, perhaps, to the project, or maybe it's a thinking kind of a model as well.
It for us, that's really fascinating. Thank you for your question. For us, it's more of a, because it started with Villa Villa, the house in Inner Mongolia, and I can't remember how many years, so our heart was broken when Villa Villa didn't go through, and there are certain ideas that keep coming back. And we try it in different ways. So for us, the model is a kind of, ongoing, conversation about this one idea. We have, I don't know, maybe 5 ideas that we keep trying. So it is a kind of ongoing conversation, but it's also a way to create a dialogue in the office with our staff to kind of, create a discourse in the office about what we are after. So the other way that we try to do that is with pinups. I hate office meetings. We have pinups and not office meetings. Trying to bring school into the office and to create this. I want to do it weekly, but it never really happens as frequently as I want to. But, where we invite other people in the office who are not working on that project to critique where we are. So it's an ongoing conversation.
Okay, and our final question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I noticed that you're so inspired by the natural surroundings of your buildings, but your buildings are really angular and use lots of hard materials. So are you happy for your buildings to be more like a frame to what you see outside, or are you searching for ways to use more organic forms and natural materials without looking too DIY?
Thank you for your question. It's probably more that we are very interested in how buildings reframe their context, but it doesn't really boil down to orthogonality versus curves necessarily as a choice for us. If I had lectured here a few years ago, I probably would have shown more installations, which tend to be less angular and more curvy by the nature of they're more experimental and they're cheaper. I mean, it's cheaper to produce. It's just more expensive. It's a very dumb, answer, but it's not a question about this or that. It's more about the context within which we're working, the construction technique, what is possible in terms of the kind of labor, what they know how to do, and the budgets of our project. Shanghai is one big circle, but we haven't built it yet.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us here tonight.